In this video, we're going to look at problems on the slides for section 12.3. In this first set of problems, we are asked to add or subtract the radicals when possible. So we start with 3 times the square root of 7 plus 2 times the square root of 7. They both have the same radical part, so we can just add our coefficients and get a 5 times the square root of 7. In this second one, we have 5 times the square root of 3 plus 7 times the square root of 5 plus 2 times the square root of 3 minus 4 times the square root of 5. So I can rewrite this by grouping the ones with the same radical part. 5 times the square root of 3 plus 2 times the square root of 3 plus, move this over a little so you can see it. Oh, that's better. Plus 7 times the square root of 5 minus 4 times the square root of 5. And then I can say, well, that's 5 plus 2 times the square root of 3 plus 7 minus 4 times the square root of 5, which gives me 7 times the square root of 3 plus 3 times the square root of 5. When we get to 3 plus the square root of 3, there's nothing we can do here. They don't have the same radical part, even though square root of 3 is the square root of 3 and 3 is the square root of 3 squared. There's nothing we can do here. We just leave it that way. Now we've got 3 times the square root of 11 minus 3 times the square root of 11, and that's just 0 because, again, anytime we subtract something from itself, we get 0. Finally, we've got 2 times the square root of 2 minus the square root of 3. And we can't do anything with that because they have different radical parts. Moving on. Next, we will deal with these problems here. We're going to add or subtract the radical expressions when possible. So we start with part A. We've got 12 times the square root of 5 plus 3 times the square root of 20. But we can change this square root of 20 because that's 12 times the square root of 5 plus 3 times the square root of 4 times 5, which will give us, we can take the square root of 4 there, bring it out and multiply it by the 3. That's 2 times 3 is 6. So that's 12 times the square root of 5. There we go, that's better. Plus 6 times the square root of 5 gives us 18 times the square root of 5. There you go. Hopefully everybody can see that. For B, we've got the square root of 3 minus the square root of 27. Well, I can rewrite this as the square root of 3 minus the square root of 9 times 3. So again, I can pull out that square. That's the square root of 3 minus 3 times the square root of 3 is negative 2 times the square root of 3. And finally, we've got 6 root 3 plus 2 times the square root of 8, and there is nothing we can do with that because the square root of 8, we can simplify it a little bit. This is 6 times the square root of 3 plus 2 times the square root of 4 times 2. Okay, well, that's 6 times the square root of 3 plus 4 times the square root of 2. But we can't combine these into a single term. Moving on. Next up, we are asked to multiply these radicals. And remember, when we're multiplying radicals, all we really want to do is multiply what's under the radicals, as long as they have the same, base. So here we've got the square root of 3 times the square root of 5. Those both have, I forget the word I'm looking for, but you know, this is the same as if we wrote a 2 out here. They both have that 2. All of these are square roots, and we don't have to worry about this. So we just multiply what's underneath there to get the square root of 15. Here we've got the square root of 7/8 times the square root of 2/3. Well, that's the square root of 14 over 24. We just multiply the numerators, multiply the denominators. We can simplify a little bit. That's the square root of 14, that's 7 over 12. 3 times the square root of 2 times 4 times the square root of 3 is going to give us 12 times the square root of 2 times 3 is 6. And finally, the square root of 3 times the square root of 12 is the square root of 3 times 12, which is the square root of 36, which is just 6. Next up. Here we're asked to multiply by distributing. Just using our rule for distribution, distributive property. We've got 5 times the square root of 7 minus 2. Well, we just multiply our 5 through. 5 times the square root of 7 minus 5 times 2 is 5 times the square root of 7 minus 10. Same thing here. Square root of 3 times 11 times the square root of 11 minus the square root of 3 times 5 will give us the square root of 33 minus 5 root 3. Finally, 2 times the square root of 5 minus the square root of 7, we get 2. The square root of 2 times the square root of 5, which is the square root of 10, minus the square root of 2 times the square root of 7 is the square root of 14. Next, we'll look at a problem using the FOIL method. The FOIL method, remember, we just multiply the first terms, the outside terms, the inside terms, and the last terms. So that gives us 2 times 5 is 10. Our outside terms gives us 2 times 2 root 3 is 4 root 3. Our inside terms give us 5 times the square root of 3 is 5 root 3. And our last terms does give us square root of 3 plus 2 times the square root of 3 is 2 times 3, which is 6. Combining like terms, we have 10 plus 6 is 16, plus 4 root 3 plus 5 root 3 is 9 root 3. Next up. Here, we're going to multiply these conjugate pairs. We've got 3 plus the square root of 5 times 3 minus the square root of 5. Well, that's going to give us 3 squared plus the square root of 5 squared. Sorry, minus the square root of 5 squared, which is 9 minus 5, which is 4. Here we have 2 root 3 plus 4 times 2 root 3 minus 4, so that's 2 times the square root of 3 squared minus 4 squared is 2, is going to be 2 squared times the square root of 3 squared minus 16. Well, that's 4 times 3 is 12 minus 16 is negative 4. Finally, we've got square root of 2 squared plus this minus the square root of 3 squared gives us 2 minus 3, which is negative 1. Next, we are asked to multiply 3 plus the square root of 5 quantity squared. Okay, well, remember that when we take something of the form a plus b squared, that's a squared. In this case, a is 3, plus 2 times a times b plus b squared. So that becomes 3 squared plus 2 times 3 times the square root of 5 plus the square root of 5 squared is 9 plus 6 root 5 plus 5 gives us 14 plus 6 times the square root of 5. Next, we're supposed to divide some radicals. We start with the square root of 12 over the square root of 4. Well, that's the same as the square root of 12 divided by 4, which is the square root of 3. When we get the square root of 2/3 divided by the square root of 7/4, we can rewrite that as the square root of 2/3 divided by 7/4, which is the same as the square root of 2/3 times 4/7, which gives us the square root of 8 over 21. If we have 5 times the square root of 20 over the square root of 10, that's 5 times the square root of 20 divided by 10, or 5 root 2. Our most complicated one here, we've got 8x cubed times the square root of 9x squared over 2x squared times the square root of 16x cubed. Well, a lot of this is pretty easy because we can simplify our radicals a bit here. That's 8 x cubed times, well, the square root of 9x squared is 3x, divided by 2x squared times the square root of 4x squared will be 4x, and then we've got another square root of x here. Okay, so we can cancel some of this stuff. And we wind up with 3x over the square root of x, which is the same as 3x square root of x over x, which is 3 times the square root of x. In the next set of problems, we are supposed to rationalize the denominators here. Okay, so here we've got 5 divided by the square root of 7. So to rationalize the denominator, we multiply this by the square root of 7 over the square root of 7. That gives us 5 times the square root of 7 divided by 7. For 4 over the square root of 8, we'll do something first. We're going to rewrite this as 4 over the square root of 4 times 2, which is the same as 4 over 2 times the square root of 2. Okay, well, that's 2 over the square root of 2, which is just going to be the square root of 2, since we know that 2 divided by the square root of 2 is the square root of 2. Next up, we've got 5 times the square root of 2 over x squared times the square root of 3x. So we will multiply numerator and denominator by the square root of 3x. In our numerator, we then have 5 times the square root of 6x over 3x cubed. Finally, we've got the square root of 2/3. So I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of 2 over the square root of 3. And I multiply numerator and denominator by the square root of 3. It gives me the square root of 6 over 3. I believe this is the last page. We just want to perform these operations and simplify if possible. So we start with the square root of y cubed times 8 times the square root of 8 times y squared. Well, that's going to be the square root of 8y to the 5th. And of course, we can simplify this because that's the same as the square root of 4 times 2 times y to the 4th times y. So that gives us 2y squared times the square root of 2y. Here we've got the square root of 1/3 times the square root of 8 over 3x. That will give us the square root of 8 over 9x. Okay, well, I can rewrite that as the square root of 4/9 times the square root of 2 over x, which gives us 2/3 times the square root of 2 over x. And now I'm going to multiply this by the square root of x over the square root of x. That gives us 2/3, or 2 times the square root of 2x over 3x. That is it for this video. If you have any questions, please get in touch.